Greetings. Welcome to another week of early Celtic Christianity. This class should really be called English Christianity from early Celtic to Middle Ages, because now it's not so early anymore. We're getting into the 7th century here. Last week, I talked about the history of the establishment of the church in Britain and Ireland, and some of the figures who were involved. Just a brief recap. There is the popular myth about the Church of England, with many people thinking that the English Church dates its history principally to the mission to England by St. Augustine of Canterbury in AD 596 or 7. And as a result of Augustine's mission, Christianity in England came under the authority of the Pope, and then in 1534, King Henry VIII declared himself to be head of the Church of England. This resulted in a schism with the papacy, and as a result of this schism, many non-Anglicans consider that the Church of England only existed from the 16th century on. And this is simply not true. There's much more to the story than just that. Churches in England were started by Romans as early as the 1st century. By the time Augustine of Canterbury arrived in England, he found there was already a well-established church. And England did not fall under the authority of the Pope at that time. That happened much later. There were many famous saints who have written about Christianity's arrival in Britain, including Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius of Caesarea, Hilary of Poitiers, among many others. Early Celtic saints who predate Augustine include St. Alban, St. Patrick, St. Columba, St. Bridget, and several others. So all these figures and churches, along with bishops, priests, and deacons, with martyrs and saints and missionaries and monasteries, existed prior to St. Augustine's arrival. Many history books fail to emphasize this, unfortunately, and this is why it's good to give classes on it ever so often. But if any of you would like to learn more about this, I would like to recommend a couple of really good books. A History of the Church in England by J.R.H. Mormon is the first one. This basically goes into much more detail about what I've been going over with all of you. I just lightly skimmed the surface, believe me. But this book is fascinating. It covers everything from the early Celtic Church to the saints, artists, and architecture, to pre-Norman kings of old, and to the Norman conquest and the kings that followed, all up to the Oxford movement and the modern church, ending at 1972. So there's quite a bit of information in there. I highly recommend it. Another book I recommend is Ye Are the Body, A People's History of the Church by Bonnell Spencer. This book starts off even further back in history to the beginnings of Christianity itself, and it covers a good portion of church history in general, including English history. One more book I recommend for those who would like to know more about actual Celtic Christianity is Every Earthly Blessing, Rediscovering the Celtic Tradition by Esther de Waal. This one covers some of the stuff I've gone over and goes even deeper and further. Quite informative and a very good read. Now moving on to this week's lesson. The early Celtic church in Britain was distinct from the church everywhere else. As we talked about last session, they had their own style. Pagan symbols like the Celtic cross that had been made into Christian symbols, among many other things. I would like to now cover a couple of other figures who are important, those being St. Oswald and St. Aidan. These two figures make up a good portion of the Christian story in England, so I had to include them in this week's lesson. In fact, they are this week's lesson, for the most part. So the Celtic Christian people, who were known at this time as the Britons, had become disrupted when in 449 the pagan Germanic peoples known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes invaded Britain and drove the native Britons north and west into Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall just south of Wales. And that's why the Celtic people reside only in those regions and not throughout all of Britain. They were driven out of England. Afterward, they established 7 principal kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. In 596 or 7, Augustine of Canterbury established a mission in Kent, where he was favorably received and became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, hence why he's known as Augustine of Canterbury. In 616 in Northumbria, Edwin seized the throne, and Oswald, son of Ethelfrith, fled into Scotland to the monastic settlement on the island of Iona, where I mentioned was established by St. Columba. Therein, Oswald encountered the Christian faith. He was converted and baptized. King Edwin married Ethelburga, a princess of Kent, who brought with her the missionary Paulinus, who became the Archbishop of York. King Edwin and many of his court accepted baptism in 627. In 632, King Cadwallon of Wales and the pagan King Penda of Mercia invaded Northumbria and killed Edwin in battle. The Queen and the Archbishop fled south, and Christianity was temporarily suppressed in the north. The following year, Oswald returned from exile to claim the throne. He met Cadwallon in battle near Hexham. The night before the battle, vastly outnumbered, with a small army of whom not more than a dozen were Christians, he set up a wooden cross and asked his soldiers to join him in prayer. They did so, and promised to be baptized if they won the battle. They joined Oswald in battle, defeating and slaying Cadwallon. The battle site was thereafter known as Heaven's Field. Northumbria, now united, became the most powerful of the 7 kingdoms, and Oswald was recognized as paramount king of the Heptarchy. His concern was for the conversion of his people to Christianity, and he sent messengers to Iona, where he had himself received the gospel, asking for a Christian preacher. Volunteers included a monk named Aidan, who, despite his inability to speak the Anglo-Saxon language, relied on Oswald's fluency to preach the gospel. Often Oswald, who was fully bilingual, stood beside Aidan as he preached and interpreted the sermon. Aidan was soon joined by other missionaries, and the church flourished in Northumbria. Oswald went to Wessex. Wessex at that time was the second most powerful of the 7 kingdoms, and later to be the most powerful and the nucleus of a united England. And Oswald went there in order to seek a bride. Wessex was at that time largely pagan, but his bride, Kinburga, agreed to become a Christian, and so did her father, the King of Wessex. Thus, a door was opened for the gospel in southwestern England. However, in 640, war broke out between Mercia and Northumbria. In 642, Penda, the pagan king of Mercia, killed Oswald in a great battle near Messerfeld. As he fell dying, Oswald prayed aloud for the souls of his bodyguards who died with him, and for the salvation of the people of Northumbria, and for his pagan enemies. Penda ordered the corpse of Oswald to be dismembered and its parts set up on stakes as a sacrifice to Odin, the Norse god of wisdom, poetry, death, divination, and magic. Oswald's head was reclaimed by Christians and sent to Lindisfarne, an island off the northeast coast of England, and is now thought to rest in a tomb in Durham Cathedral. And that is St. Oswald. Now let's backtrack a tad and talk more about St. Aidan. Here's a quick recap. The gospel first came to the northern English in 627 when King Edwin of Northumbria was converted by a mission from Canterbury led by Bishop Paulinus, who established his see at York. Edwin's death in battle in 632 was followed by a severe pagan reaction. A year later, Edwin's exiled nephew, Oswald, gained the kingdom and proceeded at once to restore the Christian mission. As I mentioned before, During his exile, Oswald had lived at Columba's monastery on Iona for missionaries, rather than to Canterbury. The head of the new mission was a gentle monk named Aidan, who centered his work not at York, but an imitation of his home monastery on the Isle of Lindisfarne. With his fellow monks and the English youths whom he trained, Aidan restored Christianity in Northumbria, King Oswald often serving as his interpreter, and extended the mission through the Midlands as far south as London. Aidan died at the royal town of Bamborough on August 31st, 651. The historian St. Bede said of him, "He neither sought nor loved anything of this world, but delighted in distributing immediately to the poor whatever was given him by kings or rich men of the world. He traversed both town and country on foot, never on horseback, unless compelled by some urgent necessity. Wherever in his way he saw any, either rich or poor, he invited them, if pagans, to embrace the mystery of the faith, or if they were believers, to strengthen them in their faith and stir them up by words and actions to alms and good works." St. Aidan was a truly charitable and humble man. I wanted to mention that I've been to the island of Lindisfarne as pictured here, also known as the Holy Island. It's a neat place and quite sacred as well. It's the famous island where you have to drive over a bridge to get to it, and you have to leave before a certain time because the tide comes in and the water covers the bridge. So if you don't leave before that time, you're stuck there for the night. That didn't happen to us, but I found it intriguing. In conclusion, I would like to point out an important note that the Church of England, as I said before, did not fall under Roman rule once Augustine of Canterbury arrived in 596 or 7. It wasn't until the Synod of Whitby in 664 that England submitted to Rome's rule. So from its establishment in the 1st or 2nd century all the way to 664, England was independent from papal rule, and instead it was governed by the monasteries. And that is where we will pick up next week. I hope everyone got something out of this session, and I look forward to next week's final session, where I will cover the Norman Conquest and the signing of the Magna Carta by King John. Until then, everyone have a safe rest of your week. God bless.